Hey everyone, this is David Escobedo. I'm going to be doing my journal entry for epistemological timeline. Sorry, I struggled to say that word. I was born in Mexico, in San Luis Potosí, in 1990. My family only lived there a year after I was born, so I only lived in Mexico for about a year. I actually do not have any memories of living in Mexico, so I don't actually really have a connection or any memories of my extended family. I feel like mainly my knowledge of my family is really just my immediate family, so my mother, my father, my two brothers, my parents. When they moved here, they were mainly looking for work, so they didn't have any specific skills or anything like that they were trying to find jobs here in the US. So really they were just looking for any well-paying job. My mom only studied up until the fifth grade, and she does have knowledge in some math and some reading and writing skills, but beyond that she doesn't she didn't do much schooling. So my father did get as far as getting into high school, and so he studied high school and maybe a little bit after that, but then I don't know exactly what he was studying, and I think eventually he just decided not to continue his education and just focus on working. So my family migrated to the US in 91. My dad is the first person to arrive in the US, and then he sent for my mother and I, who then traveled with other extended family, arriving at California. Then from California, we came straight to Chicago. In Chicago, we arrived here, and we had moved to back of the yards. So it's a South Side neighborhood by 47th and Ashland. So we lived in back of the yards for a while. I also do not have memories of this, as I was also a toddler, so I don't really recall living here too long. But from what I have heard and known, it's just back of the yards is not the best neighborhood. It's kind of considered to be the quote-unquote hood. So there's a lot of gang violence, a lot of drug use, just not safe to walk around. People were experienced being held at gunpoint or robbed. So things like that, but still primarily a Latino Mexican neighborhood, although it's changed a lot over the years. So we lived in back of the yards for a while. Then I believe my family moved, and they lived for a short period of time in Wicker Park. This is before Wicker Park was gentrified and became what it is now. Before, it was also a lot of Latinos, not a very good neighborhood to be in, but rent was affordable and cheap, and so my parents, being recent migrants, they found it pretty affordable there. And from what I was told, we used to live above a dentist office, and so my mom had a job working as a chef, or not a chef, but a cook. She was a cook. She worked at a kitchen, at a taqueria. So it's a restaurant. They would serve tacos and all that. And so she knew how to cook, so she was able to work here. Then we moved. My family's moved around a lot, so we've lived in neighboring neighborhoods. So back of the yards, Wicker Park is probably the furthest we've ever moved, and then from Wicker Park we moved back to McKinley Park. In McKinley Park we lived for a while. McKinley Park also had a lot of issues with drug use and also gang violence. Shootings were kind of common. I did grow up hearing a lot of gunshots and things like that, and people hiding, stuff like that. The park itself is actually one of my favorite places, and it means a lot to me, which I think is I think also a part of like this timeline, right? Is an area where I got to enjoy being out. I would go on walks with my grandmother. She would take me there. But yeah, so my parents, we moved around a lot. I grew up speaking Spanish at home. It is my first language, and I'd say I'm a very good listener in Spanish. I could pretty much understand anything. Vocabulary wise, I think I could expand more on that. I do get stuck a little bit in Spanish, and I do struggle speaking it more. I guess finding the correct words. Again, vocabulary. I guess not having a vast range of vocabulary limits my Spanish a little bit, but I can speak it pretty fluently, and I'm pretty fluent in reading and writing it too. My journey in actually learning English started when I was really young. I remember at one of the times when we did live in McKinley Park, I wanted to make friends, and a lot of the kids around in the neighborhood actually spoke English, and so it was hard to play with them and difficult to get along with kids because there was a language barrier. I would speak to them and they would somewhat understand me, but oftentimes not. And so I actually ended up making friends by speaking gibberish. Like, I would just make up words that sounded like English, and then my friends, the kids that I was playing with, and my neighbors, they would speak gibberish back to me. And so there were adults who watched us do this, and I remember them like kind of like speaking on it, or like kind of like making fun of it. And I recall that they found it funny that, you know, I was attempting to communicate with people and just like not using actual words and just like mimicking, like having a conversation. And it kind of worked. Like, it facilitated me getting along with other kids, and so we would play around, and we would just make like grunting and squealing noises and gibberish, and yeah, I was able to make friends. Okay. I also watched a lot of TV. I would say I think I because of TV and these interactions with my neighbors, I was able to kind of develop like English language. So I think I understood it more than I was able to like read or write it. And TV like kind of helped because it oftentimes cartoons had a narrative, and you would see all these actions, and a lot of the times they take really long like speaking turns are kind of long, so conversations are very long. It's kind of like the dialogue, right? And so I think just watching that and learning the dialogue like really helped me get a grasp of like the language and be able to like just hear words and what they mean. I was able to attribute it to like actual things that were going on in these narratives. There was a point where I had an uncle who asked me, like Chino, they used to call me Chino, which I'll also explain that in a second. He would tell me, Chino, like he's like, you're watching all these cartoons in Spanish, like how do you know, or how do you understand do you even understand what you're watching? And I was like, oh yeah, I'm like, I totally understand. And I think I was watching like the Power Rangers or something like that. And he sat there with me, and he waited like 5 minutes. And then he asked me again, he's like, okay, he's like, can you tell me what you just heard? Like, what just happened? And I tried to explain, and I think I just explained like what I saw. And he's like, yeah, he's like, that did happen, but that's not what they said. And so my uncle pointing these things out, I was like, oh, kind of made me maybe pay attention more to like what was being said, and trying to interpret that, and then making connections. So I think that kind of like spurred that questioning and trying to understand like what was it that I was like receiving, what was I watching. So yeah, that was my journey a little bit in terms of like learning English language. Shortly after, I was enrolled in school, and I was able to like make more progress in my learning. I did struggle a lot. I think by the time, sorry, I'll pause this for a second. I forgot to explain. So my family used to call me Chino because it's like a word that they use as a term of endearment, which is maybe a little bit racist, but I guess they were commenting on my facial features, I think, because my eyes are slightly slanted and our family's Mexican. They called me Chino because Chinese people have their more slanted eyes, or Asian people do, right? And so I think a general term that is, in my opinion, is racist. They refer chinos to anyone who is of Asian descent. And so I think my family, in trying to use this word, started calling me Chino as I was growing up. And it's funny because this word kind of affected me throughout the rest of my life. And I don't think they intentionally meant to like hurt me or put me down, right? Because it was meant to be a term of endearment. But as I got older and I encountered other people perceiving me as also being Asian, it affected me a lot. But yeah, my family lived for a while a lot in McKinley Park. We moved around a lot. So from McKinley Park, we moved to like Brighton Park and then back of the yards. Then from back of the yards, back to Brighton Park, then back to McKinley Park. And I've moved around so many times in my life, like I can't even keep track. But that also affected my schooling. I moved around schools a lot, and oftentimes my parents struggled to like find housing that was close to the school so that they wouldn't pull me out. But eventually, they were unable to avoid that, so it was still kind of happening. My parents actually split up when I was about in the second grade. So that also impacted my life a lot. I felt like I was forced to choose between my mom and dad, and they were living in different places. And then times that I felt like I needed their support, like it was just really difficult. My mom was a single mom, worked 2 jobs. We hardly saw her. Me being the oldest, I kind of had to become like my mom's second in command, sort of. I would go home and help start prepping like our meals. I would cut a lot of like the vegetables and things, and or even start cooking some things at a very young age, just so that when she would come home, like some of the work was already done. So I think at a very young age, I was already put in charge of like doing all of these like home things, as well as like taking care of my brother. And like I was responsible for taking him to school, for getting him dressed. A lot of responsibilities kind of fell on me because my mom was busy working, and when she would come home, she had to do all these other house things that took a lot of time, of maybe even her being able to help us with homework. And eventually that also even became something difficult for her to do, because we couldn't really because of the language barrier, she really wasn't able to like help me do much of my homework once I got to a certain grade. And I'd say that might have been like my 3rd grade or 4th grade. But yeah, my family dynamics were a little bit complicated. Separation. There was also a lot of abuse within my family. My mom used to hit me, and then her boyfriend at the time used to also be abusive of my mother and my brothers and I. So it really was not like a happy place, or like a welcoming place. It was a place that I really wanted to escape. I actually ran away a couple times, and I ended up like hurting my mom because she was like completely scared, didn't know what to do, didn't know where I was. They eventually found me. I think I ran away to a friend's house, and then I think my friend's parents like just called people and eventually got a hold of my parents, and my mom with her boyfriend at the time showed up and picked me up, and it did not go well for me. But either way, like the dynamic with my family was pretty rough. Not a enjoyable childhood. I did have extended family here, but they kind of grew somewhat estranged from the rest of the family. So my family's pretty distant. Yeah, and then like the neighborhoods that I grew up in were also not very good. Like they were often there were like different gangs or rival gangs. There were constant like shootings and like drug use. A lot of people where there was also a lot of underemployment or unemployment, and just like a lot of instances of like I guess like multiple families like living in homes. So it also felt like a lot of a sense of overcrowding. We also kind of experienced that. Like we had like other people like living in our home, so it wasn't just us in our home. It was like friends of my mom or her boyfriend at the time. There were like a couple of different people who came into the house and like they needed a place to stay. So we lived with a couple people, sharing spaces, sharing rooms, which also kind of changed like our family dynamic. My schooling, I was once I reached school, I actually got bullied a lot. People constantly commented on my physical appearance. I remember in like the second grade, I had kids who would come up to me and tell me that I was really skinny and that I looked like I was gonna die. They would tell me that they would comment on my physical features. So they would comment on my eyes and call me slur names. They would call me Chino, which is, I guess, not technically a slur name, but because of how it's used as a general term to talk about anyone who has Asian features, it's a pretty racist term to use. And yeah, I think me growing up in all of these spaces, I really just tried to avoid any kind of conflict. I didn't want to confront any of these kids. I wanted to be left alone. I turned to music, and at the time, like I had a friend who showed me like music videos on like MTV and stuff like that. And one time like we did have cable, and I remember like I was watching TV and I found like alternative and like heavy metal music, and I really connected with that music. My family was actually Catholic. We went to a couple. We weren't like active or like actively participants in practicing the religion. But then I'd say somewhere in my childhood, maybe around like 5 or 6 years old, I had an uncle who was really religious, and he turned to evangelical Christian. And so with him, I ended up going to a mega church out in the suburbs. It was called Willow Creek. And I believe it's located in Arlington. But yeah, it's one of like the mega churches here in Illinois. And there actually I experienced also like a lot of teachings, right? Like there's all these moral teachings that they were passing on. But one thing that affected me specifically was their teachings of, I guess, intolerance of queer people and homosexuality. And so at that time, I remember there was one instance where a boy and I were holding hands, and I guess like our group leader like kind of freaked out and he separated us. And then from that day forward, like they wouldn't let me and this boy be in any of their groups together or have any kind of physical proximity because of fear that we would hold hands or whatever that meant. And I don't remember that meaning anything besides just like this boy was my friend and we would hold hands, and we would just run together and be like, oh my god, like come and check this out, or come over here and play with me, and we would like hold hands. And so I don't know, like I guess the church found this very strange and they didn't appreciate it, and so they try to teach against it. But yeah, so like music kind of for me was an outlet because it was counter all of these narratives, all of these normalities of what I was taught growing up, right? And it also was kind of an escape for me from my family, from everything. It helped me make sense of a lot of the anger and things that I felt. I wanted to also share that the music that I was into also affected how I dress, my aesthetic. I was trying to dress in a different way that's kind of stood out, that wouldn't really call attention from like game bangers and that sort of thing. So I dressed in all black. I wore like skeleton things or like things with demonic or figures or creepy things. I don't know. I was just really into just kind of wanting to be apart from, I guess, what was considered like more mainstream. And trying to stand out from that and avoid conflict, because oftentimes, even if I wasn't trying to look for any, I mean, I wasn't trying to look for any conflict, like people would come and find me, right? And oftentimes that led to being jumped or like boys coming up to me and checking me like, what are you or whatever, and me being like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, I'm not anything. So yeah, just trying to avoid any kind of interactions like that. In school, as I mentioned, like I did struggle like learning English, so I eventually had to redo third grade because I flunked the first time that I was in it, and then I redid the third grade. That kind of did help me. After being in third grade a second time, I was able to kind of access more of like my understanding and access more of like the learning that was happening. I was finally able to kind of do my homework on my own, and it was more in depth. So my grades actually changed, and I started getting A's and B's. Eventually, I graduated. I went and I enrolled in my community high school, which was Kelly High School, and I ended up getting into their honors and AP program. And then there, I kind of felt like I really was able to expand a whole lot more. And I feel like a lot of teachers were really impressed with my abilities and often commented on like, how did I learn English? How do I know all of these things so well? And I was like, I don't know. I'm like, I just kind of how I explain. I'm like, I grew up just trying to speak it and watching TV, and then obviously schooling. But yeah, and then in that time, I also learned what being undocumented meant. And I really had not known what it really meant to me. But during that time, that's when I really found out that I would have a major barrier in accessing education, post-secondary, right? So going off to college, going into anything, like or even finding a job, like that would be almost impossible. And either way, like I just, my family encouraged me, like, they would be like, échale ganas, like just try your best. And that's what I did. Like that there wasn't anything else that I can do besides just persist and keep going, pushing forward. And eventually there were a couple of options that opened up. And so I enrolled at DePaul University. I got a scholarship from DePaul University. And then there, I feel like I went through a lot. Like I fell into depression. I felt like an imposter. I had a lot of guilt because my parents now had this financial commitment that it was like literally driving our family to like basically starve. And I felt really guilty for that, because then we had to choose, like, are we paying bills or are we paying my school? Are we going to cut down on what we're eating, or we're going to pay my school? And it was really hard to like kind of experience that. I was fortunate enough that like my extended family did step in, and they also contributed monetarily to like help me finish school. And so whatever gaps that scholarship didn't cover, my family did help. And so I'm just really fortunate that I did have that. That is a privilege that I did have, that I have my family connections. And even though they weren't that great, like my family still had that sense of family to be able to connect with me and help me out. So yeah, then after going to college, in college I studied art media design, and I wanted to be an educator. I wanted to do visual art. But because of my status, I realized that I really wouldn't be able to be employed. And at that time, DACA didn't exist. So I decided to go into visual art.